In a school full of astonishing stories, a teacher made an unexpected decision by sending a black girl home without pants, unaware that behind this seemingly trivial act lay an even more shocking secret. Her family was connected to none other than the legendary Snoop Dogg, setting the stage for a narrative filled with twists and mysteries that defy all expectations. The old grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight as Monica's trembling fingers hovered over the keyboard. The blue glow of her laptop screen illuminated her tear-streaked face in the darkness of her apartment. Outside, Chicago's winter, wind howled against her windows, but the storm inside her mind raged louder. 10 years of silence were about to end with a single email. I know what happened at Lakeside Memorial Hospital on April 17, 2014. Those 12 words had taken her hours to type, though they'd lived inside her for a decade. Her index finger lingered over the send button. One click would expose Dr. Nathan Reed, the celebrated surgeon whose name adorned the hospital's newest wing. One click could destroy his reputation, his career, and possibly her own life. Her phone buzzed on the desk. A text from an unknown number. "Don't do it, Monica. Some secrets should stay buried." Her heart slammed against her ribs. No one knew what she was doing. No one should have known she was even awake, let alone what she was writing. The cursor blinked accusingly on the screen, waiting for her decision. Her hands began to shake violently, rattling the half-empty whiskey glass beside her laptop. 3 rapid knocks on her door sent her jumping from her chair. The laptop crashed to the floor as she stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of medical journals. The knocking came again, more insistent. "Mrs. Broadus, Chicago PD, we need to speak with you." Monica's throat constricted. Her eyes darted from the door to the fire escape outside her window. The temperature outside was in the single digits, and she was wearing only a thin nightgown. Still, she found herself moving toward the window. "Mrs. Broadus, we know you're in there. This is about Mr. Calloway. He's been found dead." Her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto the hardwood floor. Mr. Calloway was dead? Impossible. She had just seen him that morning at the hospital, striding confidently through the halls in his pristine white coat, nodding cordially as they passed each other. The same nod he'd given her every day for 10 years, as if nothing had ever happened between them. As if he hadn't ruined her life. As if he hadn't stolen everything from her. The police knocked again. "Mrs. Broadus, please open the door. You're not in trouble. We just need to ask you some questions." But Eliza knew better. In her experience, trouble was the only thing that ever came knocking after midnight. 10 years earlier, Monica had been the rising star of Lakeside Memorial. At 32, she was the youngest chief resident in the hospital's history, with a promising career in cardiothoracic surgery ahead of her. Her colleagues respected her steady hands and quick thinking. Patients requested her by name. Medical journals published her research. And Dr. Nathan Reed, the hospital's brilliant but notoriously difficult head surgeon, had personally selected her as his protégé. "You've got something special, Broadus," he'd told her during her first week as chief resident. "Don't waste it." What she had was dedication born from tragedy. At 14, Monica had watched her father die of a heart attack while waiting for an ambulance in rural Pennsylvania. By 15, she'd decided to become a heart surgeon. By 23, she graduated in the top 3% of her medical school class. By 32, she was on track to become one of the youngest cardiothoracic surgeons in the country. April 16, 2014, had begun like any other day. Eliza arrived at the hospital at 5:30 a.m., reviewed charts, checked on patients, and prepared for a routine bypass surgery scheduled for 9 a.m. The patient was Walter Green, a 67-year-old former high school principal with a history of heart disease. "You know the drill, Mr. Green," Monica said during her pre-op visit. "When you wake up, you'll feel like you've been hit by a truck, but your heart will be good as new." Walter had smiled and squeezed her hand. "Just make sure I wake up, Doc. My granddaughter's graduating next month and I promised I'd be there." The surgery had proceeded normally until it didn't. Walter's blood pressure suddenly plummeted. His heart began to fibrillate. The anesthesiologist called out alarming numbers as Eliza worked frantically to stabilize him. Then Dr. Reed had burst into the operating room. "Step aside, Broadus. I'm taking over." "But sir, I can..." "Now, Broadus." She'd stepped back, confused and frustrated as Reed moved in. What happened next still haunted her dreams. Reed made an incision that Eliza immediately recognized as incorrect. She'd opened her mouth to object, but the withering glare he shot her made the words die in her throat. Minutes later, Walter Green was dead on the table. The official report stated that Walter had died from unforeseen complications. Eliza knew better. She'd seen Reed's mistake clear as day. When she confronted him privately after the surgery, his response chilled her to the bone. It was an unfortunate outcome, Broadus. But medicine isn't perfect, and neither are surgeons. Let it go. But she couldn't. That night, she'd drafted a detailed report for the hospital board, documenting Reed's error. The next morning, before she could submit it, Reed had called her into his office. "I understand you're upset about yesterday," he'd said, his voice unnervingly calm. "First major loss is always hard." "It wasn't just a loss," Monica had replied. "It was a mistake, your mistake." Reed's smile had disappeared. "Careful, Broadus. Accusations like that can end careers, yours, not mine. I have 20 years of flawless records and a wall full of awards. You have a promising future that could vanish with one word from me." When she'd continued to press, he'd slid a folder across his desk. Inside were photos of her daughter Kayla, who was being mistreated at school. "Would be a shame if something worse happened to your daughter at Eastside Elementary, under my friend's supervision." Monica had felt the blood drain from her face. Ryan had stolen her prescription pad months earlier, during a relapse. She'd changed all her passwords and security protocols immediately, but apparently not before Reed had discovered it, or had someone discover it for him. "This stays between us, Broadus," Calloway had said. "Walter Green had complications, period, understand?" She'd left his office in a daze, the report still clutched in her hand. By afternoon, she'd shredded it. By evening, she'd called her husband Snoop and discussed transferring Kayla to a different school. By the next morning, she'd requested a transfer from cardiothoracic to the emergency department, as far from Reed as possible while still remaining in the same hospital. For 10 years, she'd maintained her silence, watching from a distance as Reed's star continued to rise. He became department head, then chief of surgery, then the face of Lakeside Memorial itself. Meanwhile, Eliza's once promising career stagnated in the ER, where she became known for her clinical efficiency and emotional detachment. The weight of her silence had slowly crushed everything she'd once loved about medicine. Her colleagues noted the change, but attributed it to burnout. Only Eliza knew the truth. Every day she went to work at Lakeside was another day she betrayed Walter Green and everything she'd once stood for. Until tonight, when something inside her had finally snapped. The police officers who entered her apartment were Detective Marcus Wilkins, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair, and Detective Amara Chen, a younger woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. They took in Eliza's disheveled appearance, the fallen laptop, and the half-empty whiskey glass with professional neutrality. "Dr. Martin," Detective Chen began, "when was the last time you saw Dr. Reed?" "This morning," Eliza answered, her voice hoarse. "Around 8:30, we passed each other in the main corridor." "Did you speak to him?" "No. We haven't had a real conversation in 10 years. Detective Wilkins raised an eyebrow. "And why is that?" Eliza felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up her throat. 10 years of silence, and now they wanted her to talk. But Reed was dead. The leverage he'd held over her, over Ryan, was gone. "It's complicated," she managed. "Professional differences." "Professional differences," Chen repeated, her tone making it clear she didn't believe that was the whole story. Dr. Reed was found in his office at approximately 11:15 p.m. by a security guard. Initial evidence suggests digitalis poisoning. Eliza's medical training kicked in automatically. Digitalis, that would cause cardiac arrhythmia, leading to... She stopped abruptly, the implications hitting her. "You think he was murdered?" "We know he was," Wilkins said. "The question is by whom? The security footage shows only 3 people entered his office today after hours. His assistant, who left at 8 p.m., the janitor, who was there for less than 2 minutes at 9:30, and you, Doctor Martin, at 10:45 p.m. The room seemed to tilt around her. That's impossible. I've been here all evening. Chen produced a tablet showing grainy security footage. On the screen, a figure in a dark coat and surgical cap entered Reed's office, stayed for approximately 5 minutes, then left. The camera angle doesn't show the face clearly, Chen said, but the height and build match yours. That's not me, Eliza insisted, panic rising in her chest. I haven't set foot in Reed's office in 10 years. I couldn't. But, even as she denied it, memories of the draft email on her laptop flashed through her mind. I know what happened at Lakeside Memorial Hospital on April 17, 2014. Had someone seen her writing it? Had someone known she was finally ready to speak? Up. Had someone decided to silence Reed before she could expose him? The detectives exchanged glances. We'll need you to come down to the station, Wilkins said. There are more questions we need to ask. As they led her to the door, Eliza's mind raced. Who else had known about Reed's mistake? Who could have access to Hospital Digitalis? Who would benefit from his death? And most disturbingly, who had texted her tonight, knowing exactly what she'd been about to do? The police station buzzed with late-night activity as Eliza sat in the sterile interview room, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of lukewarm coffee, more for something to hold than any desire to drink it. The adrenaline that had carried her through the initial shock was wearing off, leaving her exhausted and terrified. The door opened, and Detectives Wilkins and Chen entered, followed by a third person, a woman Eliza hadn't seen in nearly a decade. Doctor. Sarah Winters, Eliza whispered, stunned. Sarah had been Reed's assistant 10 years ago, a quiet, efficient woman who'd seemed more like Reed's shadow than an independent person. She'd left Lakeside abruptly the same year as Walter Green's death, with rumors suggesting a nervous breakdown. Hello, Eliza, Sarah said, her voice stronger than Eliza remembered. It's been a long time. Dr. Winters came forward after hearing. About Reed's death, Detective Chen explained. She has information relevant to the case. Sarah sat across from Eliza, her hands folded neatly on the table. I saw the email you were drafting tonight, she admitted. I still have access to the hospital's internal email system. Old passwords no one ever bothered to change. You sent that text? Eliza asked incredulously. Sarah nodded. I wanted to warn you, but I was too late to warn Nathan. Detective Wilkins leaned forward. Dr. Winters, please explain to Dr. Martin what you told us earlier. Sarah's composed expression cracked slightly. I knew about Walter Green, Eliza. I was there that day. Not in the operating room, but in Reed's office afterward. I heard him threaten you. I saw what he did. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. And he wasn't the only one. Eliza felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. What do you mean? Walter Green wasn't the first patient Reed sacrificed to protect his reputation. There were others, at least 4 that I documented. Sarah produced a small flash drive from her pocket and placed it on the table. Records, dates, names. I've been collecting evidence for 10 years. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Eliza asked, stunned. The same reason you didn't. He had leverage over me too, different kind, same result. Sarah's smile was bitter. My nervous breakdown was carefully orchestrated after I questioned one too many discrepancies in his records. Detective Chen picked up the flash drive. Dr. Winters approached us 6 months ago with this information. We've been building a case against Reed since then. Wait, Eliza said, her mind struggling to process this new information. If you were already investigating him, then his murder complicates everything, Wilkins finished for her. Someone got to him before justice could. And that someone, Chen added, made it look like you did it, Dr. Martin. A chill ran down Eliza's spine. Who would do that? Who else knew about all this? Sarah's expression darkened. That's what we were hoping you might help us figure out. Reed had powerful allies at Lakeside, people who benefited from his success and would be damaged by his disgrace. Like Dr. James Harrington, Eliza said, the name coming to her suddenly. The hospital board chairman, he and Reed were close. Reed helped secure the funding for Harrington's pet research projects. Chen nodded, making notes. Anyone else? Eliza closed her eyes, thinking back to the hospital's political landscape. Dr. Victoria Lindstrom, Chief Administrator. She fast-tracked the Reed cardiovascular wing last year, and she hesitated. A memory surfacing. The night Walter Green died, there was someone else in the observation room above the OR. I remember seeing a figure, but I was too focused on the surgery to notice who it was. "We'll check the old security footage," Wilkins said, "if it still exists." "It won't," Sarah said quietly. "Reed had the hospital's archive system upgraded 3 years ago. Conveniently, many old records were lost in the transition." Eliza's mind was racing now. That person in the observation room, they would have seen Reed's mistake too. They're either a witness or an accomplice, Chen finished. Or the killer, Wilkins added grimly. The implications hung heavy, in the air. Someone had murdered Reed, possibly to silence him, possibly to prevent Eliza from exposing him, or possibly for reasons they didn't yet understand. And that same someone had framed Eliza for the crime. "What happens now, Eliza?" asked, her voice small. "Now," Detective Chen said, "we set a trap." The hospital corridors felt different the next morning as Eliza walked through them, hyper-aware of every glance and whisper that followed her. News of Reed's death had spread quickly, along with rumors of her late-night visit to the police station. She kept her head high, forcing herself to maintain the same detached professionalism she'd cultivated for a decade. The plan was simple, but dangerous. Eliza would continue her normal routine with one significant change. She would subtly let it be known that she possessed evidence about Reed's misconduct, evidence that hadn't died with him. The detectives hoped this would flush out whoever had framed her, forcing them to make another move. She was the bait. The detectives were watching, and somewhere in the hospital, a killer was waiting. By mid-morning, Eliza found herself in the doctor's lounge pouring a cup of coffee as Dr. Victoria Lindstrom entered. The chief administrator's face was drawn with what appeared to be genuine grief. "Terrible business with Nathan," Victoria said, her voice lowered. "I still can't believe it." Eliza nodded non-committally, remembering her role. "Some secrets don't stay buried forever," she murmured, just loud enough for Victoria to hear. Victoria's hand paused mid-reach for a coffee cup. "What did you say?" "Nothing important," Eliza replied, adding casually, "I'm organizing some old files tonight. It's amazing what turns up after 10 years. She left Victoria standing frozen by the coffee machine, her heart hammering in her chest. The seed had been planted. Now she had to wait to see what grew from it. Throughout the day, Eliza dropped similar hints to key figures, to Dr. Harrington during a brief elevator ride, to the hospital's legal counsel during a chance meeting in the cafeteria, and to Reed's current assistant while collecting patient charts. Each time she watched carefully for reactions. Harrington had seemed merely annoyed. The legal counsel had looked nervous. Reed's assistant had turned pale. By evening, exhaustion and tension had Eliza's nerves frayed to breaking point. As she prepared to leave, her pager buzzed with a 911 call to the hospital rooftop, the helipad used for emergency transports. It wasn't her department, but the specificity made her suspicious. She texted Detective Chen, then took the elevator to the top floor. The April night was cool and breezy as she stepped onto the rooftop. The helipad was empty, no medical team in sight. A solitary figure stood at the edge, looking out over the city lights. "Hello, Eliza." The voice stopped her cold. It belonged to Dr. Michael Foster, the anesthesiologist who had been present during Walter Green's surgery. Foster had been a fixture at Lakeside for as long as Reed, always in the background, rarely drawing attention to himself. "Michael, what are you doing up here? Where's the emergency?" He turned to face her, and in the dim light, she could see he was holding something in his hand, a syringe. "There is no emergency," he said softly. "Not yet." Understanding dawned. "It was you in the observation room that day," she said. "You saw what Reed did." Foster nodded, taking a step toward her. "I saw everything, just like I saw everything else Reed did over the years. We started together, you know, same residency class. He was brilliant, truly brilliant, but reckless, taking shortcuts, I covered for him once early on, then again and again. His laugh was hollow. Eventually, you're in too deep to get out. You helped him cover up his mistakes, Eliza said, the pieces falling into place. All those years. I protected the hospital, Foster corrected her. Reed brought in millions in donations. His research saved thousands. What's the greater good, Eliza? A few patients or the institution that saves countless more? Eliza felt sick. Walter Green had a family, a granddaughter. He mattered. Everyone matters, Foster said dismissively, but some matter more than others. Reed understood that. I understood that. You never did. He took another step forward. When I saw you writing that email last night, I knew it was finally over. Reed had become sloppy, arrogant. It was only a matter of time before he dragged us all down with him. So you killed him, Eliza said, backing away slowly, and tried to frame me. A poetic solution, don't you think? The disgruntled former protege finally snapping after years of resentment. Foster's smile didn't reach his eyes. But then you had to start digging today, dropping hints, making people nervous. Eliza glanced toward the rooftop door, gauging the distance. Where were the detectives? Had her text gone through? You won't make it, Foster said, reading her thoughts. And even if you did, who would believe you? The doctor suspected of murder, making wild accusations about a respected colleague. He raised the syringe. This will look like suicide. The guilt of killing Reed finally too much to bear. As he lunged forward, Eliza ducked and pivoted, thanking whatever instinct had driven her to take self-defense classes after Reed's threats years ago. Foster stumbled, off balance, the syringe slipping from his grasp and skittering across the rooftop. It's over, Michael, she said, positioning herself between him and the fallen syringe. The police know everything. Sarah Winters has been collecting evidence for years. Foster's face contorted with rage. Sarah, that mousy little... Nothing. She doesn't have anything concrete, neither do you. He charged at her again, but this time Eliza was ready. The struggle was brief but violent. Foster's desperation gave him strength, but Eliza's decade of suppressed anger gave her something more potent. As they grappled near the edge of the roof, a lifetime of silence and fear crystallized into a single, clarifying moment of courage. I won't let you silence me, she gasped, as his hands closed around her throat. Not like Reed did, not like I silenced myself. With a surge of strength, she broke his grip and shoved him backward. Foster stumbled, arms windmilling as he teetered on the edge of the roof. His eyes widened in shock and fear. The rooftop door burst open as Detectives Chen and Wilkins arrived, guns drawn. But they were too late to intervene, and just in time to witness Foster lose his balance and disappear over the edge with a fading scream. 1 month later, Eliza stood before the Lakeside Memorial Hospital Board, her hands steady as she delivered her testimony. The room was packed with hospital staff, press and families of Reed's victims, including Walter Green's granddaughter, now a poised young woman in her 20s. 10 years ago, I chose silence over truth, Eliza concluded. I believed I was protecting my brother, my career, myself. But that silence protected only those who abused their power and betrayed their oaths. It didn't protect Walter Green or any of the other patients who deserved better from this institution. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of her colleagues, some ashamed, some defensive, some relieved that the truth was finally out. We have been given a second chance to rebuild this hospital on a foundation of integrity and accountability. I hope we have the courage to take it. As she stepped away from the podium, a weight lifted from her shoulders, not completely gone, but lighter than it had been in a decade. Outside, spring rain washed the city clean, and for the first time in years, Eliza felt something like hope. Sarah Winters was waiting for her in the hallway, a tentative smile on her face. That was brave, she said. Eliza shook her head. Not brave, necessary. She hesitated, then added, I'm going to need help rebuilding the cardiothoracic department. Someone I can trust. Sarah's smile widened. I might know someone. Together, they walked toward the hospital exit, where Ryan waited to drive Eliza home. He'd been sober for 5 years now, working as a substance abuse counselor in the same facility that had once treated him. "You okay?" he asked as Eliza slid into the passenger seat. She considered the question, looking back at the hospital building with its newly removed Reed Cardiovascular Wing sign. "No," she answered honestly, "but I think I will be."